In 1925, a man sold the Eiffel Tower to a Paris scrap dealer for a fortune. The tower was not for sale. Months later, he came back and sold it again. His name was Victor Lustig, and he may have been the most accomplished confidence man in the world. He was born in 1890 in a small Bohemian town, then part of Austria, Hungary. By his 30s, he spoke several languages fluently, dressed like an aristocrat, and had spent years working the transatlantic ocean liners, fleecing wealthy passengers at cards and with a fake money printing gadget he called the Romanian box. His method was never brute deception. It was patience. He listened, flattered, agreed with whatever a mark believed, and waited for the moment a person's own greed opened the door. By 1925, the ocean liner cons were wearing thin, and Lustig had drifted to Paris looking for something bigger. He found it on a cafe table. A short newspaper article complained that the Eiffel Tower was falling into disrepair. The city had built it as a temporary showpiece for the 1889 World's Fair, and now, decades later, the iron giant was rusting and enormously expensive to maintain. The journalist wondered, half seriously, whether it might simply be easier to tear the thing down. Most readers would have turned the page. Lustig read it twice, because in that small civic complaint he saw the shape of a con no one had ever tried, not a swindle over jewelry or stock, but over a landmark that belonged to no one and everyone at once. The plan he built was audacious precisely because it was so large that questioning it felt absurd. Lustig had a forger produce official stationery from the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, the government body that oversaw the tower. On it, he presented himself as the deputy director, general of the ministry, a man important enough to make decisions, obscure enough that no one would casually check. Then he sent discreet, confidential letters to 5 of the largest scrap metal dealers in Paris, inviting them to a meeting on a matter of state importance. The secrecy was not a flourish. It was the engine of the entire scheme. When the dealers arrived at the Crillon, Lustig explained, gravely, that the government had decided the Eiffel Tower was too costly to keep. It would be demolished and sold as scrap. Thousands of tons of iron were about to come onto the market in a single lot. But, and here he lowered his voice, the decision was politically sensitive. Parisians loved the tower. If word leaked before the sale was final, there would be an uproar. So the bidding had to remain absolutely secret, and it had to move fast. To the dealers, the secrecy explained everything strange about the deal. Of course, a government would be nervous about tearing down a national symbol. Of course, they would want it handled quietly. The very oddness that should have warned them instead made the story more believable. Lustig then took the whole group on a chauffeured tour of the tower, playing the board official, showing off merchandise he happened to be legally required to sell. He barely glanced at the iron overhead. Instead, he watched the dealers. Which of them asked sharp questions? Which of them stayed quiet and eager? Which one leaned in a little too far when the numbers were mentioned? He was not really collecting bids. He was hunting for one man, the one most desperate to be chosen. He found him in André Poisson. Poisson was ambitious and insecure. He was newer to the Paris dealing world, hungry to prove himself among older, better, connected rivals, and the idea of landing a deal this enormous, a contract handed to him personally by a government minister, was intoxicating. He was exactly the kind of man Lustig looked for, someone whose desire to belong was stronger than his caution. But there was a problem. Poisson's wife was suspicious. Why the rush? Why the secrecy? Why was this obscure official operating out of a hotel instead of a ministry office? Her questions threatened to unravel the whole thing before it paid out. So Lustig did the strangest thing in the entire con. He arranged a private meeting with Poisson, dropped his voice, and confessed, not that the deal was fake, but that he was corrupt. This is the move that separates Lustig from an ordinary swindler. A lesser con man would have piled on more reassurance. Lustig went the opposite way. He implied, as one worldly man to another, that a government official's salary was insultingly small, and that a gentleman securing a contract this valuable would naturally want to show his gratitude. He asked Poisson for a bribe, and that request is exactly what dissolved Poisson's doubts. Because in 1920s Paris, a bureaucrat demanding a kickback was not a red flag. It was proof. A swindler wanted your money and vanished. A real official wanted your money and stayed greedy, inhuman, and utterly ordinary. By asking to be bribed, Lustig transformed himself from a suspicious stranger into a familiar, believable kind of crook. Poisson stopped worrying that the deal was too good to be true. Now he was worried someone else might get it first. Poisson paid for the Eiffel Tower. On top of the purchase price, he handed over the bribe. Lustig collected it all, walked out of the hotel, and boarded a train to Vienna with a suitcase of cash. Then he waited for the storm, the arrest, the headlines, the manhunt. Nothing came. Because Poisson, when he finally understood what had happened, did the one thing Lustig had gambled on. He said nothing. The humiliation was unbearable. A man trying to make his name had been tricked into buying a monument that was never for sale, and had bribed a con artist to do it. Reporting it meant admitting all of that in public. So Poisson swallowed the loss and kept quiet, and the greatest con in Paris simply never reached the papers. For most criminals, that silence would have been the perfect ending. Take the money, disappear, never look back. Lustig looked back, because the silence told him something irresistible. The con had left no trace, and a con that leaves no trace can be run again. So Victor Lustig returned to Paris and sold the Eiffel Tower a second time. He rebuilt the whole apparatus. The forged ministry stationery, the confidential letters, the grave hotel meeting, the tour, the secrecy, the hunt for one ambitious, insecure mark. By most accounts, he assembled a fresh group of scrap dealers who had no idea the same tower had already been sold months earlier to a man too ashamed to warn anyone. The genius of the first con had become its own cover for the second. But this time, the machine slipped. His chosen victim grew suspicious before the money changed hands and took his doubts not to a wife but to the police. It was the exact reaction Poisson's shame had spared him the first time, and now it arrived all at once. The storm Lustig had escaped was finally breaking. Detectives began looking for the elegant government official who kept selling the city's most famous landmark, and for the first time the con had a witness willing to talk. Lustig did not wait to test his luck. He fled France for the United States and vanished into the country, where he would spend the rest of his criminal life. A place large enough to keep reinventing himself in. In America, the legend only grew. Lustig ran the Romanian box-con for years, selling the same fake money, printing machine to greedy buyers who watched it produce a single real bill, then eagerly paid thousands, only to discover the box was empty of everything but two planted notes, and a long delay engineered to let him disappear. He is even said to have conned Al Capone, taking $50,000 on the promise of doubling it, then returning every cent 2 months later, claiming the deal had collapsed. The move stunned Capone, who had expected either profit or betrayal, not honesty. Impressed, Capone reportedly handed him $5,000 as a gift. That gift, most tellings agree, was the real target all along. Lustig had never intended to invest anything. He had simply performed integrity, because he understood that a gangster's trust was worth more than any single score. He was so confident in his craft that he is credited with a private set of rules, a kind of con man's catechism: be a patient listener, never look bored, wait for the other person to reveal their politics and their pride, then agree with all of it. Never boast, never discuss your own affairs, never appear eager for money, and never look at your watch. Every rule sanded away the one thing that gives a swindler away, the appearance of wanting something. The whole philosophy pointed in a single direction. Make the victim feel that trusting you was their own clever idea, so that when the money finally moved, it felt less like a sale and more like a decision they had made all by themselves. But the con that finally destroyed him was quieter than a monument or a mobster. In the 1930s, Lustig ran a large counterfeiting operation, working with a skilled engraver to push fake banknotes so convincing that federal authorities feared the flood could shake public confidence in American currency itself. It was his most profitable scheme and his most fatal. Every earlier con had depended on the victim's silence. This one left a physical trail. Each forged bill was a piece of evidence, and there were said to be enormous quantities of them moving through the country. A river of counterfeit money that agents could follow upstream, straight back toward its source. In 1935, he was arrested in New York. Even then, he nearly escaped for good. Held in a federal detention center in Manhattan, Lustig knotted a rope of bedsheets, slipped through a window, and climbed down the wall in full view of the street below. As the story goes, he paused partway down, calmly wiped at the building, as though he were nothing more than a passing window cleaner, and strolled away. He was free for weeks before agents finally caught up with him in Pittsburgh. There was no third act. Lustig pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years for the counterfeiting, with more time added for the escape. They sent the man who had sold the Eiffel Tower twice to Alcatraz, the one island built to hold the people no one else could keep. The suit, the languages, the endless patient charm, none of it worked on a cell block. There was no ambitious Mark to read, no wife to reassure, no train to Vienna waiting at the end of the con. He served out his time on the rock, his charm useless against stone and cold water. In 1947, he died of pneumonia in a prison medical center, far from any hotel suite or ocean liner. The last documented detail is the one that lingers. On the paperwork recording his death, in the space asking for his occupation, someone wrote "the apprentice salesman." The man had sold a national monument to a stranger's face, sold the same monument again out of pure nerve, and sold trust itself to one of the most feared criminals in America. And in the end, the official record could only describe him as someone still learning how to sell. So consider what actually made him work. Lustig's real weapon was never the forged letterhead or the rented suite. It was his understanding that people will talk themselves into a lie far more thoroughly than any liar could talk them into it. Poisson was not destroyed by a document. He was destroyed by his own hunger to be important, and by a swindler patient enough to let that hunger do the work. The tower was only ever the bait. The real machine was the man across the table, watching, waiting, and letting you convince yourself.